It is over. Bernie Sanders has officially been declared the winner of the New Hampshire primary. As I'm recording this right now, about 90% of the votes are in. Bernie Sanders is up on Pete Buttigieg by about 1.8%, but going by the popular vote count, he has over a 4,000 vote lead on Pete Buttigieg. There's no way he's coming back. I'm looking at my phone. A couple outlets are declaring officially that Bernie Sanders is the winner, which means statistically it's impossible for Pete Buttigieg to come back. And so this is, even though the percentage isn't huge, this victory is huge for Bernie Sanders, because this is coming right off the heels of Bernie Sanders winning Iowa. He won the popular vote in Iowa, and like has been repeated many times over the last few weeks, literally no Democratic presidential candidate has ever won Iowa and New Hampshire and not went on to become the nominee for the Democratic Party. So this is huge, and this is in addition to all the other signs that are pointing to Bernie Sanders looking like he's going to run away with this nomination very early in this primary season. I did a video earlier where I cover how Bernie Sanders has officially, for the first time ever, including the 2016 race, has taken the lead in the Real Clear Politics average of polls. Bernie Sanders consistently, repeatedly is putting up record fundraising totals. Nate Silver, notorious Bernie Sanders hater, smear merchant, mouthpiece for Hillary Clinton and the establishment wing of the Democratic Party, even he admits that Bernie Sanders is the favorite to win every single primary contest for the rest of the primary election cycle, which is unreal. I think maybe he has Joe Biden as the favorite in South Carolina. Highly, highly doubt that at this point, after this abysmal showing that he's put out. Him and Elizabeth Warren, like I said, two of them are dead men walking. The campaigns are over. Both of them finished in single digits, not leaving New Hampshire with a single delegate. I mean, this is embarrassing for both of them. I don't know which one it's worse for. Joe Biden was running his entire campaign on how he's the most electable, but can't break double digits. Did he break double digits in Iowa? I have to check on that, but barely. And he's getting his ass handed to him by Amy Klobuchar and a mayor from a small town. So both of them are really in the gutter. The campaigns are all but done at this point. We're just waiting for them to officially drop out of the race. That's what I'm waiting for. There's no way they're coming back. It's really looking like Bernie Sanders is the soon to be undeniable Democratic nominee for the 2020 race, which will be huge. It will be momentous. And this is the beginning of a political revolution. That being said, seeing how this is an election night, I subjected myself to something that I almost never do, and I've spent hours watching the mainstream media coverage of this election, and I have to say, even though this is a big night, this is a big win for Bernie Sanders, I'm going to have to do this video, and I'm going to be a little salty, maybe a lot salty, because one thing that was crystal clear tonight, watching CNN and MSNBC and these other mainstream media outlets for hours, is their disdain for Bernie Sanders was on full display. I just ran down the list of all the ways that it looks like Bernie Sanders is, all the signs pointing to Bernie Sanders being the Democratic nominee. And how did there was never a moment when the results were being reported. There was never a moment when Pete Buttigieg actually had more votes than Bernie Sanders in this New Hampshire primary. So knowing that, how did the mainstream media cover the results coming in tonight? It was horrendous. I kid you not. The overwhelming majority of the time that they spent talking or providing commentary, they were talking about how well Amy Klobuchar was doing in third place and how she's overperformed expectations, and how Pete Buttigieg, the underdog, small town mayor, is giving Bernie Sanders a run for his money. So I shit you not, maybe between 85 to 95% of the coverage tonight was heaping unreal amounts of praise on the people in third and second place. All the while, mostly ignoring Bernie Sanders. And the very small amount of time that they spent talking about Bernie Sanders, it was just to badmouth him. They could have had a conversation about, you know what, this is really looking like is Bernie Sanders, this is going to be the party of Bernie Sanders. He's going to be the Democratic nominee, and he's going to be setting the agenda for the Democratic Party. They could have had a million conversations about what that means and how historic this is, and how this might really be the beginning of a political revolution of social democracy and populist grassroots leftists taking over the Democratic Party and taking over the country. They could have had a million conversations about that. But like I said, 90% of the time they were heaping praise on Amy Klobuchar and Pete Buttigieg in third and in second place. And when they did talk about Bernie Sanders, they were literally they try to put the blame on voter turnout not being as high as it was expected on Bernie Sanders. They were like, oh, he's the one who says that he's running a get out the vote campaign, and he's prides himself on energizing the base and getting a lot of people to show out, but there wasn't a lot of show turnout. So what Bernie has to explain himself for that? Like, really? Don't you think everybody in this race is running on and saying that they're trying to get out the vote as much as possible, energize the base as much as possible to come out to vote in this election? So why do you put all the blame on Bernie Sanders? And it wasn't just that, it was that, and it was, oh, Bernie Sanders underperformed, and when it was just him and Hillary Clinton, it was a blowout, and coming into this, everybody was expecting Bernie Sanders to win by 10 points, 8 points, but this is a sad showing for Bernie Sanders, and it's not really a good night for him. That was literally the 5% of the time that they spent talking about Bernie Sanders tonight. That's all they were saying, and it was mind-blowing, which leads me to the next one I want to make. And the last point I want to make, which is, I'm seeing some people in progressive circles like getting the jitters about Pete Buttigieg and thinking that because he's finishing so close to Bernie Sanders in Iowa and Nevada and in New Hampshire, that he's going to try to give Bernie a run for his money for the nomination. And this kind of ties back into what I was just talking about the media's clear disdain for Bernie Sanders. Whatever momentum Pete Buttigieg had and boost and bump that Pete Buttigieg had coming into New Hampshire, was there a lot of it, and it's hard to exactly quantify this, but because this is an intangible factor, but a lot of the bump and momentum he had coming into New Hampshire was based off of this sham election that the DNC ran in Iowa, and that the media basically legitimized. I was hearing about some of the exit polls during the night, and apparently it was like around 50% of the people who turned out to vote in New Hampshire, they literally just made up their minds about which candidate they were going to vote for in the last few days, and basically like the last week since Iowa. So let's set some facts. Let's get some facts straight. That's 50% of the people who turned out to vote tonight. Those 50% of the people who just decided which candidate they were going to vote for, I can guarantee you they aren't exposed to any new media. They aren't exposed to any progressive media online. And most likely the only way they consume news and information about the primary and about anything in general is from mainstream media, and it's from watching CNN and watching MSNBC and ABC and all these different news outlets. So that's a fairly reasonable assumption to make about those 50% of people who just made up their minds on which candidate they were going to vote for. Knowing that, like I said, the mainstream media for the last week has just legitimized this sham election that was run in Iowa. And for those of you who don't remember, and I'm sure all of you do, we had a race where one candidate in this race, Pete Buttigieg, was allowed to pay for an app to be developed by a company full of his donors and avid, active supporters that was supposed to record the entire election results for the entire state of Iowa, which is unheard of, which is unprecedented, the amount of conflict of interest there. And if that wasn't enough, the DNC aided and abetted in this because they knew about it beforehand and they co-signed this. They gave it a green light. And then after that, we find out that very same app began to malfunction, quote, malfunction, and was literally changing the votes and taking votes away from Bernie Sanders. So right there, this entire thing should have been thrown out, and really no one should have accepted those results from Iowa as legitimate. But the mainstream media didn't, they barely mentioned a peep about this, and instead they ran with the narrative that Pete Buttigieg was winning in the irrelevant and inconsistent state delegate count, and they literally ignored the fact that Bernie Sanders was winning in the popular vote the entire time, and they ignored the fact that the DNC was selectively releasing results, which again, unprecedented, for days, slow drip of results from precincts that favored Pete Buttigieg, again creating this narrative that Pete Buttigieg was beating Bernie Sanders for days, and gave him this fake victory and denied Bernie Sanders a real victory and all the headlines that and momentum that he would have gotten had this not been a sham election, and had there not been a bunch of DNC fuckery the entire time. The mainstream media ignored all of that and just in an unreal display manufactured consent for a sham election, one of the most illegitimate elections I've ever seen in my lifetime. They pretended like it was real. They pretended like the results were anything that we should like they pretended like there shouldn't be there wasn't a giant shadow and question mark over the results, and they just went with Pete Buttigieg is the winner. And they ignored the fact that they were just literally changing the vote count. They were caught red-handed changing the vote count on the app that Pete Buttigieg paid for. And then the Iowa Democratic Party mysteriously gives Pete Buttigieg 2 more national delegates than Bernie Sanders, even though Bernie Sanders has the lead in the popular vote. So in a sane world, the mainstream media should have laughed their ass off at any notion that we should take those results from Iowa seriously. But instead, they propped up Pete Buttigieg. They gave him insane momentum and created this entire narrative for everyone in the country watching who doesn't know better and isn't exposed to independent media that Pete Buttigieg just beat Bernie Sanders in Iowa, which wasn't the case. And again, ignoring the fact that even as rigged as the shit was, Bernie Sanders won the popular vote. So Pete Buttigieg comes into New Hampshire with all of this coverage saying that he won Iowa, which he didn't, gets all this momentum. And like I said, 50% of the people who voted in New Hampshire tonight made up their minds in the last few days, almost entirely, I'm sure, based off of whatever the mainstream media was telling them. So just flip it in your head. Imagine if all the time the mainstream media was talking about Pete Buttigieg's delegate lead in Iowa, or giving him this fake win on this sham election. If every single time they mentioned Pete Buttigieg in Iowa, instead of doing that, they mentioned the fact that he paid for the app that was caught changing the votes, and they mentioned all the shadiness that the DNC was pulling behind the scenes. If they did that, those 50% of people who went into New Hampshire undecided for the last few days, they would have had a lot different view of Pete Buttigieg. They would have thought he was a goddamn cheat. They would have thought he just rigged a state election, and they would have thought this man cannot be trusted, and he's a liar, and he's a fraud, and he's corrupt as all hell. That's what the narrative that those 50% of people would have had, but instead it was the exact opposite. So the mainstream media is largely responsible for whatever momentum Pete Buttigieg came into New Hampshire with. And it was just amazing to watch them act like they had nothing to do with it. Act like, oh my God, can you believe that Pete Buttigieg has this huge surge and he's overperforming like this? Yeah, I can believe it because you just gave him a win in a sham election. So this was, like I said, I admitted up front when I did this video that there's going to be a lot of even though this is a great night for Bernie Sanders and his supporters, I'm still very salty because mostly the abysmal failures of the mainstream media, how they covered this night, and the boost that they gave Pete Buttigieg coming into New Hampshire that made us even anything close to what it is, even though Bernie Sanders still beat him handily by over 4,000 votes. So like I said, great night for Bernie Sanders. Amazing work from Bernie Sanders' campaign and all the people who volunteered for him and his whole team that put everything into winning Iowa and New Hampshire. And like I said, Bernie Sanders is on track to win the Democratic nomination. And that is an undeniable fact at this point. And another huge takeaway from tonight, the complete, utter failure of Elizabeth Warren and Joe Biden. Don't let anybody tell you that these two are going to give Bernie Sanders a run for his money when it comes to this nomination, because they're dead wrong and they're lying to you. The two of them are dead men walking, and I'll do a separate video about that. But Bernie Sanders looks like he has a clear path to the nomination, and there is no one standing in his way. So let's just see how much the DNC is willing to cheat him outright to stop it from happening.